My name is Mark Vernon, and I'm joined by Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert,
Hello, Mark. Nice to see you.
for another in our conversations about good and bad therapy. And today we thought we would talk about transference and countertransference. Now, they're big words, Robert, but give us a thought to get us into this subject.
Well, we were just chatting about how to make this subject a bit more clickable, and we came up with the idea that we should call this session "Should You Fall in Love with Your Therapist?" Because, in a sense, that gets at this question of transference and countertransference, which, as you say, complex technical words, but they're really about the relationship between the therapist and their client slash patient slash analysand. So that's what we're getting at today. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the frame before, so that it overlaps a tiny bit with that. But this is really about, the relationship between the two people in the room and what can and should, can and shouldn't but does happen between the two of them. So that's essentially what we're talking about. So
Yeah.
um,
I mean,
and,
maybe it's worth just going for a sort of starter for 10 kind of definition.
yeah,
And roughly speaking, transference is what you as the patient client might project onto the therapist. And then the countertransference is how the therapist might experience that. So, a very simple, probably too basic, but nonetheless, example would be how, you as, say, a younger man walk into a room with an older woman as your therapist, and immediately she becomes a maternal figure to you. And the therapist might experience that as you, I don't know, seeking comfort from the relationship, when really she's sitting there thinking, but I thought you came to do a bit of work here as well. And so in that kind of situation, at some point, the therapist might say, you come along, I think, asking about your life, these questions, and yet it seems like you also are looking for comfort and some kind of succor here as well. And I wonder, what that says. Now, she may not say, I think you're treating me like your mother, but nonetheless, using the information of her experience, the countertransference, to try and move beyond the experience that the client has of her, which would be the transference. And if you get stuck in that kind of countertransference relationship, then things may not progress very much. And then, adverse kind of feelings might come about, like, frustration or even annoyance. So that'd be one possible response. There would be others, but at least I hope that gives a sense of this transference and countertransference and what it might be about.
might be worth adding, Mark, that countertransference is sometimes used as the analyst's own transference onto the patient of their own material as well. So, in your example there, the analyst, because they're human beings, have their own unconscious projections going on and might unconsciously be seeing their patient as their son or something like that. So there's that kind of variation on countertransference.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, because actually for a long time in psychoanalysis, countertransference was thought to be something to be avoided at all costs. And it was only in the 1950s, I think, that it began to be regarded as something that therapists might use. And this goes back, as I understand it, right to the days of Freud, where one of Freud's early collaborators was working with a patient, and he developed feelings for her. She actually even had a kind of phantom pregnancy as a result of all this. And so Freud thought, well, for one thing, I think he thought this is going to bring psychoanalysis into disrepute. But also it's sort of too confusing. It's going to sort of spoil the scientific approach that he sought to develop. And so he was wary of, well, the transference and also the countertransference. I think in Freud's own time, he recognized that transference was inevitable. It was going to happen. And so you had to work with that. But he refused to work with the countertransference for a long time, actually. Well, I think he refused all the time. And then it was only latterly that with figures like Winnicott and Melanie Klein that countertransference began to be accepted as something to work with rather than just something to sort of understand and try and put to one side.
You mentioned the word scientific there, and that's another way into this subject, perhaps, because as a client going along to your therapist, you might expect that you're going to be seeing an objective professional. You're there to talk about just the content of your problem. So you're going in to talk about anxiety or what have you. And you'd expect it to be a fairly neutral place in which you serve up your content and the analyst analyzes it, and that's it. So the inclusion of the feelings towards the analyst by the patient and vice versa could be seen as a kind of almost anti-scientific proposition. And I'm talking about this partly because, you know, Freud was anxious, particularly in his early work, to establish psychoanalysis as a scientific discipline. And people may know, you know, he started as his first paper was on the neural ganglia or something like that. He was a kind of a neurologist, essentially, and you know, potentially shaping up even to be a kind of neural surgeon. And a lot of the early work, particularly the language he uses, talks about psychological processes in fairly neurological terms, you know, opening pathways in the mind and so on. So given that background, you can understand there was a bit of trepidation about entertaining the notion of transference and countertransference, because suddenly we're including a whole kind of non-objective sphere or an apparently non-clinical sphere in that, you know, in the projects of psychoanalysis. You know, why would the relationship between the two be important at all? Surely, if psychoanalysis was valid as a science, it should work independent of those sorts of factors. So I think it's worth saying that just to put it in a bit of context, and then how revolutionary it is really to begin to think about the role of the patient's projections and vice versa in the room. It's like, I mean, you're the physicist, Mark. You know, it's this idea that, you know, particles change, don't they, if they're according to when they're observed or not observed. So the objectivity of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is a complex one, basically.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and this is still much disputed. Certainly the critics of psychoanalysis would regard transference, countertransference as the kind of woo that discredits the whole thing. But even within psychotherapy, there is, I still think, quite a big debate about this. I mean, I think it's a good debate to have, though, because I think one of the problems that psychology more broadly has is the fact that we are these living creatures with reflexive minds. I mean, you know, you reference there physics and the world of subatomic particles, and you know, there's even a lot of dispute about whether the observation affects the particle and so on in that world. Well, whether or not it does, if that's the right way to interpret quantum theory, certainly for we humans, the minute you engage with someone else, the minute you start thinking about someone else, there's already a lot in motion. And so I think that in defense of psychoanalysis, recognizing that and thinking about that is absolutely fundamental. And conversely, if you try to ignore that and keep this ideal of the scientific approach, which, you know, is mostly, I think, how psychology operates, it just leads to problems. It's recognized now as what's called the replication crisis, when many of the experiments done in psychology prove very hard to replicate. And because there aren't the controls that you can, at least in theory, have with, say, a physics experiment. And the minute you do a psychology procedure again, the whole environment has changed. I mean, to be different people, different context, and even the awareness that an experiment such as this has been done before will affect the results of how things go in the future. You know, it's, I think, a related issue is why often novel psychological approaches such as, say, CBT or mindfulness, the early results are often very good because the novelty itself raises hopes and expectations. But then as it becomes manualized or normalized, the efficacy tends to fall off. because people don't have that extra kind of boost. Their transference onto the procedure itself, you might say, wears off, at least in terms of positive benefits. So I think you've got to think about transference and countertransference, however you then regard to treat them.
Yeah, I was just thinking it makes for a strange paradox, the fact that as a therapist or as an analyst, one of your kind of professional tenets really is that you remain pretty much as neutral as possible. And certainly in psychoanalysis, that's an extreme version really, because your psychoanalyst might be out of view while you sit on the couch or lie on a couch. They may say very little indeed. And the room that they will invite you into itself will normally be, not always, but normally be pretty pared down. There might be one or two sort of token paintings on the wall, but that's about it. The paradox is that, and this is something Jacques Lacan writes about, the paradox is that in becoming so neutral, the analyst becomes like a blank screen, basically. And of course, the more they're like a blank screen, the more latitude there is for the patient to project onto that screen, to continue the metaphor, because there's little to get in the way of that. The analyst isn't correcting or has provided so little material about themselves that the scope for projection is kind of widened in a way. So it's an odd paradox there. It's set up so that transference is sort of minimized in a way, but actually it can have exactly the opposite effect. And part of the point of that neutrality in the first place is to stimulate, to allow the unconscious mind essentially to relax in front of the therapist or analyst. But it does have this other paradoxical potential in it that, that the less you say, the more I can read things into your silence, basically.
Yeah, and I think that what's sometimes called the total situation then kicks in, and this was a paper, I think, by Betty Joseph, for those of our listeners who are following these things up, maybe even in the training. I know we have a few, and in which it was one of the sort of seminal texts, certainly in the UK, that led to the incorporation of the countertransference into the treatment process. Because what Betty Joseph, if I've got that right, argued is that this sort of minimalist approach in terms of the furnishings of the room, particularly, and in terms of what the analyst doesn't reveal about themselves, means that in a way it's all projection. That's all that's going on, and so the argument here is that the therapist must and only really work with what they know directly themselves, and which is their experience of what's going on. And so this is to bring in countertransference, the feelings that you have as the therapist, as really the sort of foundational data of what's going on in the room. It's not that you don't trust what the client says, but you're always testing that in this approach against how you're feeling. And if what the client says strikes you uneasily, or you're sitting there with a completely opposite feeling to what they say they're feeling, or even how they're looking, you've got to follow that up somehow, with sensitivity in time, and so on. And psychotherapy is an art, in this case, not as a science. But yeah, that idea that a kind of almost a pure psychoanalysis treats the countertransference as the bedrock in this total situation, it became very sort of widespread. And even when I was training 10 or more years ago, this was almost held up as a kind of ideal, actually, which I wanted to critique, actually, which maybe I could say why, but that I don't know quite how the Lacanian approach would respond to that. Was Lacan pointing out the paradox but saying, in practice it's a good thing, or was he sort of enjoying the paradox for its own sake?
I think actually in Lacan's case, just to answer specifically about him, Lacan was very influenced by the German philosopher Hegel, and I think Lacan really has in the back of his mind the dialectical, what Hegel would have called the dialectical relationship between the two, which is a power structure, basically. So you project, fear, for example, onto the analyst, and that subjugates you in turn. So the blank screen becomes a tool of power. Actually, the blank of the screen, the more powerful you can become, because you become the holder, like a sort of big brother figure, I suppose, of all of the hopes and fears, actually, of the people who are sort of looking up to you. So I think his take is a little bit more, slightly more political, for want of a better word.
Well, but that resonates with me, which is why I have grown wary of this sort of idea of the total situation, because if you're inviting someone to dwell only in their projections, that's pretty crazy making, actually. Where is the reality principle going to come in? Where is, no doubt, a lot of the fantasies that we have, we do certainly have, but where can that be grounded? Where can that be tested? And I think if the risk for me is that an analysis that just gets caught up in almost an interminable interpretation of these projections does risk going on forever. And I feel it's part of the problem that psychoanalysis has with this reputation that it just goes on and on and on and on, unless there's a kind of point at which it reconnects with the wider world again. And then, of course, learns how, the patient can then learn how to relate the way they are to the wider world. That itself is part of the task. But there's another balance here to be struck, putting it another way, where it's not like, okay, so you don't have a minimalist room, you just have a room that's full of your stuff, because clearly that would have the opposite effect. There might be almost no space for the patient at all to bring their inner life forward. But nonetheless, working out how to show something of yourself or bring in elements of the outside world. I mean, I'll tell you one way that this has come up in recent times, even in the last year or more, is how someone might have walked into the room, say 3 years ago, and say, I'm terrified of a nuclear bomb going off over Europe, and because at that time the likelihood of that was pretty slight, you could more or less interpret that as some kind of paranoia. Whereas now, of course, I still think the likelihood of that's pretty slight, actually, but it is much more widely discussed because of the war in Ukraine. So how you balance that kind of reality, shared sense of concern, with what's going to be the patient's own anxieties, is a really pressing question. But I think just to stay in the countertransference, can well, maybe even be sort of re-traumatizing, I suppose, would be another way of putting it, to use the popular parlance. You're just inviting all the darkness out with sort of nowhere for it to go.
I like that, Mark. I like that idea of, what about the reality principle if you're in this endless loop of transference and countertransference and so on. I like that. It makes me want to say a little bit more about the physical setup. Now, I do find it fascinating of the room. Firstly, just to remind people, if they don't know of what Freud's study was like. Anybody who's been to the Freud Museum in London, in Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, will know it's full of stuff, absolutely chock-a-block with kind of ancient artifacts and little mini totems and relics and all the rest of it. It's a sort of anthropological version of a kind of reliquary or something. It's you can almost mistake him for a sort of a religious man because of all these icons he has. But anyway,
maybe that's a subject for a further.
Maybe it is.
Was Freud a religious man?
Yeah, well,
I suspect he was.
We should certainly do something about therapy and religion, I'm sure, because it's obviously a sort of almost dogmatically secular practice. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked. Just a little bit more on the physical setup, because psychoanalysis is the most sort of formidable version of the therapies, probably the most rigorous, perhaps. And one of the things that makes it rigorous is that it does try to limit transference and countertransference through the physical setup, through the minimal room, and through the fact that the analyst is out of sight. And that's interesting to me when I contrast it with two other versions of where the therapist sits in the room. And in psychotherapy, I'm not sure if you do this in your practice, Mark, but in psychotherapy, generally speaking, you'll sit opposite your therapist, you as a patient, and will see them certainly all their upper body, particularly the face. And that has all sorts of benefits, of course. It's more relational, it's more human, it's maybe less intimidating, and all the rest of it. But a bit like this thing of quantum physics and whatever. And you viewers can see this now. Mark and I, as we talk, we tend to nod at one another. When we see each other, when I see Mark nodding, I kind of nod, and when he smiles, I kind of smile a bit. So there is a bit of mutual mimicry that goes on a bit. And if you watch it, in the pub or something, you watch groups of people, just social interaction does lead to, a fairly high degree of mimicry. And that can produce empathy and affirmation and all of those things, which is great. But it carries the counter risk, which is that some objectivity might get lost. The two people might get caught up in a story together, which they are then contributing to. So the empathy risks there a bit more transference and countertransference and a bit less objectivity, perhaps. I mean, I'm not saying this is definitely the case, and it depends on the therapist, but it's interesting just physically what the different physical signals lead us to feel, as a result of what position we're in. And then the third setup, and the one that I'm most familiar with, because Mark, like me, does a lot of work in systemic family constellations. And in a constellations group, you'll sit in a circle, but the client will usually sit directly on your right or left, usually your right as it happens, but at your side facing out, which is obviously neither being completely out of view as an analyst nor opposite the other person. So you don't have complete removal, but nor do you have this sort of tendency towards empathy. And one of the ideas behind that is that you're sort of existentially, as it were, traveling together on the road of life with your client, but in parallel and not together. And that positioning is supposed to facilitate a sense of movement forward on the part of the client, whereas the face-to-face, theoretically, might suggest you just remain in the problem, a bit like the loop you were talking about, without a sense of being able to leave or have agency of your own as the patient. So I think that's the physical setup for me is really fascinating in terms of some of the immediate biases that might be in place, particularly in terms of transference and countertransference that might be generated.
No, I mean that is, I mean, because there's a transference onto the setup, as we've been saying, and I mean, I guess the kind of having, if people are sat in chairs, then rather than directly opposite at a sort of angle, at least that encourages some sense of a third position that invites transference onto that, which then might be the future, and so elicits certain kinds of responses. That's really fascinating. I mean, and it also reminds me, the traditional business of lying on the couch, of course, itself, that sort of prone position fosters regression. Every time we lie down, we are inclined to regress. We need that to help us go to sleep. And of course, it brings back memories at some unconscious level of what it was like to be put to bed, laid into a cot. And, again, traditional psychoanalysis really values contact with those early states of mind. It's very much based on the premise that getting in touch with those early states of mind is the way to resolve problems. And so the combination of position and using the transference, countertransference is precisely the way to get back to those unconscious states, unconscious because they were made before there was memory. They're often said to be sort of held in the body, and or before there was language to process things, which is why they're important to access, and can cause people such troubles. But I guess that, there are other ways of approaching such early states, and a more Jungian approach, for example, which is always done in chairs, would be, say, to wait on dreams or wait on synchronicities, which are, I think, other ways in which that which you as an individual aren't conscious can emerge, can show up. And I think that having sort of being cautious and even critical about certainly the total situation with the countertransference, I still think that a kind of suite of possibilities is really useful, and when you're with someone, but I guess for me, increasingly sort of balancing my countertransference with what else is going on, alongside, say, dreams or other things that the person might talk about, including a certain amount of factual information. A timeline is often a very, very valuable thing to do with someone, if only because it brings certain possibilities into mind that then you can test and try out. But the great thing about the countertransference, like a dream, is that it can prompt discussion about something that otherwise you might just not have a sense of at all. And psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, is to distinguish itself against other kinds of psychological help. I think it's got to be in this domain of what we're otherwise not aware of at all, or only fleetingly.
Yeah. I like that idea of the timeline, actually. And I noticed that in my more conventional consultancy work, just how powerful it can be just to retrace the steps of what happened when, particularly when something's gone wrong, and to find out what happened in what sequence. But at the very beginning of this episode, we were joking about, should we call this, can I fall in love with my therapist? And it's a non-trivial question, actually, because, it happens, obviously. It happens, one hears anecdotally about it. There's literature about it too. And maybe we can just spend a minute on this specific aspect of transference and countertransference, of course, it happens the other way too. The analyst can fall in love with the patient. But there is something, and maybe it's to do with power dynamic, if that's not too simple a way of putting it, whereby the patient, because of that setup, might be a little bit more predisposed to falling in love with their therapist anyway. And, why is that? And it may be because, a therapist is there to offer help. So one of the things that is going to be projected onto them, or at least a candidate for it, is that they will be a savior in some way of the patient. So the patient is kind of predisposed to idealize, or at least there's a tendency for that, an idealizing of the therapist, because they are in this position of a sort of savior. And with that sort of mysterious arts, it's not like going to the doctor where they prescribe something very tangible, like a medicine or an injection or something. It's pretty mysterious and sometimes miraculous how the healing works. So there's that disparity or asymmetry just in the contract, really, between the two. But I think it's also worth saying that it's the other way around too, because just as there is idealization of the therapist based on hope, and all of those things can lead to a kind of falling in love, I think there's equally the reverse, a sense of anger with the therapist when they don't come up with a quick answer, when they don't say anything and they just remain silent, when they call the session to a close on time, even though you're in the middle of something important, when they continue to disappoint you, really, because in a sense, all they're ever saying to you is, I can hold up a mirror to you, but in the end, it's your issue. And they're always, a good therapist is always saying actually precisely the opposite. I can't save you. I can I can work with you to help you save yourself, but I'm not going to step in and be the hero here. So kind of no point trying to fall in love with me because I'm just a practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, I think another reason why love will come up is that these very early states of mind, if that's what is accessed, are erotically charged. Now, to borrow Freud's phrase, it's an infantile form of sexuality. But, these early phases of our life, when we're very much in our bodies, it is about what's pleasurable, what's painful, what's satisfying, what isn't, what we want to hold, to suck, all these kind of very primitive experiences are at play. And so a psychoanalysis that is interested in early regressed states of mind is going to evoke that infantile sexuality. But of course, it's now happening in an adult who's actually in the room. And so it's, not unlikely, and maybe is fairly likely, that some kind of erotic response will be present. Now, more often than not, that's sort of easy to hold. It may be fleeting. It may be that, as it were, the other part of the adult self present, just doesn't want to go there, and maybe is a bit shocked or horrified that such a feeling might come up. But it is why I think ethical codes are so strict and clear about how two people in a room together in a therapeutic context handle themselves, because there's a sense that this is an area where the erotic can become very powerful. Plus, what you're saying there about power. I mean, the Hegelian analysis of kind of master-slave relationship is very apt, and we understand more and more about that as well. But again, it's something I think that ideally you don't sort of turn your back on. Ideally, you work with a supervisor, and where there's a very free relationship where you can talk about such things when they occur. On the premises, it's much better to talk about them than it is to feel ashamed or embarrassed about them or worried, concerned about them, and try and push them back underground where, you don't need to be Freud to realize that just, increases their potency. And so, again, treating that kind of experience as useful information and then working out how to hand it back to the client, if it is the client falling a bit for the therapist in a way that doesn't humiliate or belittle, of course, because that again is where the art of the therapy comes in, but maybe interprets. I think you would love to have a hero who could lift you out of this situation. So what you might say, what would the hero tell you? What would they give you? And then the invitation is to discover that within yourself rather than projecting it onto the therapist.
I like that a lot. And it reminds me that the space of therapy, the space of psychoanalysis is in a way like a microcosm of life in general, or a laboratory example of it, or a microcosm or something, or a fractal, in that, the skilled therapist can help the client navigate a real life situation in a kind of simulated environment, because it's a safe space, it's contained, the analyst isn't going to do anything inappropriate. And therefore, allowing the client to sort of fall in love with the therapist has its benefits, because then the process can be reflected on as it's happening. So you got kind of an in real time opportunity as a client to see what's going on in your own processes of, falling in love, what it is that's triggered you, what it is that you idealize, who the analyst reminds you of, what it is you think you're being saved from, what those, and insofar as there are erotic aspects to it, what the erotic attractors are and why it is you go for them. So that process of the kind of laboratory element of transference and countertransference makes it a learning environment too for the client. The idea being then look, if you're falling in love with your analyst, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because through that process, you can understand what makes you fall in love. And therefore, your self-awareness increases so that when you're kind of out in the real world, you know not to fall for people who are going to, be bad for you or whatever, or to repeat patterns that haven't served you very well in the past. So it's, there is an element of the kind of training environment, I suppose, in there.
No, I mean that's very valuable, because of course, transference and countertransference doesn't just happen between the therapist and their client.
Yeah.
It's happening all the time. And the
Yeah.
only difference is that you've pared down and given the space to reflect on what's going on. But immediately, with luck, it will have really useful application in the wider world. You'll know why you find certain situations intimidating, or don't want to go somewhere, do want to go somewhere else. All these sorts of things, who you like or inclined not to like. With luck, it can be very illuminating of all that.
Mm.
There was one other area which I wondered about raising, and I know that I think you enjoy almost as much as I do nods towards what might be called the paranormal or the bit unusual. But I have wondered whether what in psychotherapy we call the countertransference and transference might relate to how they might actually present themselves as therapists, but maybe more mediumistic or clairvoyant people might offer healing. Let me say, how this actually really first became clear in my mind was that was in this practice of supervision. And I used to work at the Maudsley Hospital, and we had a great supervision team. And in psychotherapy, supervision doesn't mean checking off that you've administered the right drugs. That kind of very, super ego-ish approach to supervision. It's quite the opposite. It's actually a space where you can say openly and trustingly what's going on, and then that can be thought about. And I had a team with my fellow therapists and a supervisor that was really great for that. It felt so open. But what often would happen is that you might bring someone along, by which I mean, talking about them when it was your turn in the supervision group, and someone else in the group, is maybe half a dozen people, would say, as you were talking about their sadness, I was feeling absolutely murderously angry. Or someone else might say, as you were talking about what happened to them, for some reason I was thinking another person's involved here that's not being spoken about. So information would constellate, and I think it is another form of constellations, as you were saying, that you weren't aware of as a therapist at all, but somehow was in the field that you had invoked by talking about this person. And it would be picked up by someone else in the room. Now, I don't think these things get picked up just purely randomly. There was no doubt something in the person who picked it up that resonated with what I wasn't picking up, because it didn't resonate with me. But that sense that through supervision, and then again in this field of transference and countertransference, there's kind of information that may be really valuable, but that if you were just going on an objective scientific approach, you'd never come anywhere near of. And if you did wonder strange thoughts about this or that, you might dismiss. It's really worth, I think, bringing those in. And when I picked up this, started realizing this was a really tremendous thing, valuable thing, it made me think about people that, maybe go into different states of mind, and perhaps what they're able to do, the good ones. I'm sure that there's a huge variety of people trying to do this, but the ones who really could claim to have some sort of mediumistic or clairvoyant capability, maybe they're dropping into this field that we know as the transference and countertransference, and are able maybe almost to step outside of their own ego consciousness almost completely, and bring that in, therefore tap that and then vocalize it or share it in some way with someone for whom they're doing a reading. I wonder whether you like that idea.
I absolutely love it, actually, and that already makes me want to sort of riff on it, I suppose, a tiny bit, because we've talked about, as it were, conventional transference. The patient thinks that the therapist is their mother. That's the first example you came up with, which is a very classic one, mother, a parent figure, mother or father. But just going from what you said, what if occasionally what's projected onto the analyst is that which cannot be named? In other words, an excluded or repressed or hidden person, who's somewhere in that patient's system, but has not been included or represented. So as you would in a constellation, you would have the excluded person brought in and represented. Maybe there is this slightly more spooky notion of transference whereby, unconsciously, that's what the analyst is being recruited for, as a screen, as a vessel for the embodying of excluded people from the patient's system in some way. So it's a kind of variation on what you're saying, and it hasn't occurred to me before, but might be some mileage in that, that idea that, other voices get brought in somehow. You talked about your group, but it could happen in the session itself, I suppose. I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have tried to talk to a couple of clairvoyants that I know, and put this theory to them. The trouble is that, it's such a different language.
Yeah.
And in a way, you can try and explain transference and countertransference, but it's only when you've felt it that you kind of know what's really being talked about. And again, maybe the frame matters hugely here as well. If you go and see someone with some sort of mediumistic capability, and the way they have their setup is going to be very particular to them, because they'll need that frame to drop into this altered state. Typically, anyway. I mean, there are some, I think, who sort of have access to that all day, every day. But yeah, so it's a hard thing to really compare and contrast, but I'm certainly intrigued by it. And in some ways feel, why wouldn't the modern world, which tends to exclude these things, also come up with ways in which we actually access them once more? Because they're part of the human psyche, they're part of who we are. And I think a lot of psychotherapy actually more generally is a kind of response to the removal of maybe religious, spiritual, divination practices, whatever it might have been in former times. Psychotherapy kind of rushes in to fill the gap. And hence, again, maybe it's just to sort of come back to where we started once more, it's going to have to talk about things like transference and countertransference. It's kind of part of the deal with these, alternative, in the sense of not straightforwardly scientific or objective practices, approaches to therapy.
Yeah. Well, maybe that gives us a topic for another session. So I'm conscious of time, Mark. We should probably begin wrapping up, shouldn't we?
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, look, we'll certainly chalk up the possibility of psychotherapy and religion, but I hope we'll have other ideas as well, and that this has been useful for people to listen to.